Okay, well, there's plenty of food for thought there. We do have some microphones floating around somewhere. There's one, and there's another one somewhere. Here we are. So who wants to ask a question? Down here, Professor Fenner.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nahan. Quick question that's slightly tangential to the main focus of your presentation, but you commented favourably on the RUD Mark 1 reforms back in 2008, 2009. Now, an intrinsic component of those reforms was the COAG Reform Council. The COAG Reform Council was abolished in the first Abbott government. Even though it was unilaterally abolished, even though it was a joint collaborative venture between the Commonwealth and states, I listened carefully for any objection from the states, but didn't hear any. Do you have a comment on whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, or whether that was a good direction Australian federalism was going in or not?
I guess theoretically it could have been a potentially useful platform to keep. However, it wasn't going anywhere. It was more on motion and process rather than outcomes. It wasn't getting the delegation from the Prime Minister's office as to real reform. And it was better to cauterize it and start again in first principles to get something done. I go to a number of both energy and treasury meetings. They're very useful sometimes, though energy is less useful because the eastern states are fundamentally different than ours. Treasury is always useful. But in terms of reform, it was essentially driven by the Commonwealth for Commonwealth interference, Commonwealth dominance, and process-oriented. So it wasn't so much the idea of the council itself, but its history and where it was going. That was the general perception. And there wasn't a huge number of states who were really upset about its expiration. Something like it will have to be put into place, that's for sure. But so sometimes when institutions have a good theoretical purpose but have gone off the rails, you let them die and you start again.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Nahan. My name's Ian Kerr. I'm from Catalyst, which is not the ABC program, but a local transport and planning consultancy. You spoke quite strongly about the damaging effect of federal government forcing change on the states, and in particular actions that are to the detriment of subsidiarity. And I empathise very much with that sort of approach. But I ask the question, in these circumstances, is it not hypocritical to be requiring local governments to spend $100 million on forced local government amalgamations without any assessment of the benefits, and when experience in other places in Australia and overseas strongly suggests that any anticipated benefits are almost entirely illusory?
Yeah, you're the Ian Kerr suing the state about local government reform. I could say that's sub judice, but I won't. As to, first, in reality, local government under our Constitution are agencies of the state. They're not, our Constitution does not have recognized local government as a separate entity. So they are not, like they are in other nations, recognized by the Constitution as a separate. Second, there is huge scope for reform, and other states have shown that in local government. Right? There's a lot of resistance to it, and it's politically difficult, but there's huge reform on that. So in the case of local government reform, it isn't one level of government dealing with another. It's the same one dealing with itself in a different form. And second, there is huge scope for improving efficiencies in local government. There's a lot of resistance to it, but there's huge scope to do so. Oh, and a lot of resistance. And that's what we're trying to drive through reform.
Chris Toomey from the WA Council of Social Service. Dr. Nahan, I noted there's been three key issues that have been talked about in the White Paper Federation process. It's been health, education and housing. And I noted you commented on health and education. I was wondering what you thought about a changing of responsibilities around housing and homelessness and what that might mean for the viability of our public housing system and the issues we have with affordability here.
Yeah. role of there has been a lot of policy evolution in housing. Back in the 90s, the Commonwealth decided they were going to get out of funding and provisioning and operation of public housing and fund largely rent assistance. Okay, it's good delineation. But one thing that drives a lot of the Commonwealth involvement is it has the taxation powers that the states don't. It has the money bags and a desire to address it. Theoretically, you would say, well, if the states had the access to the tax base, they should be able and be at the level of government responsible for housing. After all, they control the planning, the land access, the services to it, and all the other myriad services that users and consumers of public housing have. Okay? The only reason the Commonwealth really is in this space is they have the money. That's not a good reason. Okay? And at times the Commonwealth has acted quite effectively, has interacted with the states saying, well, we do have the money, and we're going to give it to you as long as you spend it on, let's say, Aboriginal housing. And the Western Australian government has gone out there and rolled out 4,000 Aboriginal homes under RUD on a whole range of programs. It wasn't just us. That's okay. But if the states have a role of providing public housing, and that should primarily be the role of the states. As to how you fund that, that can be separate literally from that role. If the Commonwealth can come out with a broader policy perspective of comparing how different states do it, efficiency, interstate migration, that's good, but I can't see that. So as to rent subsidy, because they did it on a national basis, that made a lot of sense. So, and rent subsidies are still very important.
Peter Kennedy, Business News Treasurer. About the GST, under what circumstances do you think governments would be seriously prepared to consider the rate, an increase in the rate, and the scope of the GST? And if so, when do you think that might happen?
Well, as I said, the Western Australian government's not going to look at the GST. It ain't the GST, it's the way you share it. Until we resolve that, we have no incentive, no inclination to enter into a debate about broadening the base or increasing the rate. That's the bottom line for us. As to the Commonwealth, I think they are leading us down a path at the next election. I think they will do what Howard did, go to the election at change. I hope they do that, because taxation change of this nature is quasi-constitutional, and you need validation of it. Okay, so I imagine they might, and there's a lot of hurdles to jump before you get to that. I'll tell you, go and put a plan to changing either the base or rate. It's a hard one. My own view is that they would probably just look at the rate, because getting the base through the PUP party will be difficult. They're a very broad-based party in some dimensions, but I doubt they will reform that. So you would think they would look at the rate, but the Western Australian government rule is that the criteria is not, the issue is not the GST, it's how you distribute it. And there are other ways you could do. One of the arguments we could have is put the GST aside and how you share it. Well, we're not going to do that. We're looking at the sharing. But there might be a range to, outside the Grants Commission process, look at sharing revenue from LNG, for instance, which they did for the Northwest Shelf arrangements. So the GST debate will go nowhere unless Western Australia gets some change on the distribution.
Mr. Nahan, Joseph Poptrishing, also from WA Business News. I was absolutely stunned at your answer to Ian Kerr. You basically said that local government is really state government. Well, why in the heck do we have it? Why not just abolish all councils and put them under the Department of Local Government, if that's what they are? That's point one. The other question is, if that's the case, why did Colin Barnett and Tony Simpson, prior to the last election, go around promising there will be no forced mergers, and then as soon as the election was over, they started moving to forced mergers to create now 15 jumbo councils rather than have the 30 that we've traditionally had in Western Australia in the Perth metropolitan area?
This shows that local government's an issue. A couple of issues. One, I'm just dealing with the reality is our Constitution does not have a separate level of government called local government. There was the previous government, my memory was considering an amendment to that effect. That was dropped by both parties at the last election, and because it wasn't going to go ahead. But the reality of the issues, the local governments are not officially a different level of government. And why don't we get rid of them? Why don't we get rid of the Department of Transport? There are logical reasons, and including subsidiary, why you have local governments doing what they do. That's because reforming them doesn't eliminate those needs and responsibilities. The question in terms of reform is, could they be structured geographically differently? Yes. And then the other issue is what we have done to date. We haven't forced anybody to amalgamate. We've really pushed them. We've forced them because if we hadn't done anything, nothing would have happened. If you don't jostle them to think about their boundaries, to think how they can do things better, they won't. They won't. It is, and really, this is, at least in the city of Canning, they get less than 20% of the people vote. So this isn't a set of bodies that are really, they are in touch with the community because they provide the parks, the roads, the rubbish, but the public are not really deeply engaged in. Might add, no one overlooks at the books, no one assesses their performance, no, they don't have a rating agency looking at them, they don't have a stockbroker looking at them. These groups are not scrutinized. So what we're doing is looking at them, pointing them areas where they can get reform and efficiencies, and giving them a strong nudge in that direction. Well, it criticizes about forced mergers when we do it, not before we do it.
Thanks very much, Minister. My name's Jim Gill, and I enjoyed your talk. It seems to me that a lot of nearly all the debate around these sorts of issues is very inwardly focused in Australia, and it's all about sort of distributional and redistributional issues. And it just seems, I like your view. It seems to me that we miss out on the bigger picture. If we put ourselves outside Australia and look at Australia as really a major trading nation, and if the debate is on the level of what causes us to be a better or a worse trading nation, and how we can actually increase Australia's competitiveness on the world stage, it seems to me if the debate was from that angle and research was carried out from that perspective, then maybe that leads us to much better conclusions as to, well, if you like, incentives, infrastructure investment, distributional, redistributional issues, whether we should encourage people to live in northwest Tasmania or in the Pilbara, that sort of thing. It just seems to me that the international trade perspective is the high ground. And if we suddenly, for example, the Bank West Curtin Economic Centre starts, commenting from that kind of a level, then we might be much more influential than by just sort of focusing on internal distributional issues.
A couple issues on that. If you look around the world and you look at structural change in governments, look at the European Union. They are going through a federation of types, evolving for different reasons, mainly to stop any wars of all wars, but they're integrating. The ASEAN, even some of the Latin American, I forgot the name of that grouping. Countries are seen integrating trade, taxation, other industry policies. And the reason why is that trade's driving that. what is driving this huge differential in the income concentration in Australia? It's trade, mainly China, with us. Little old Western Australia represents 10 to 11% of population, represents 60% of our exports, and is driving the pulse of the nation from here. And that's changing Western Australia, it's changing the nation, and it's changing our institutional structure, and you have to respond to it. It happened in the 90s in New South Wales when the real growth of the financial sector took place, along with the superannuation sector. Sydney became the dominant centre in Perth, in Australia, or more than Victoria. And those differences are driven by international forces, as you suggest, and we need to be able to accommodate them. Allow those forces to be tied and exploited, if you wish, adapted, growth, without holding them back through a redistributive mechanism. I'm not saying at all, no one would argue the case that we shouldn't have redistribution to northwest Tasmania. It's actually a very beautiful place. However, it's the extent and directions of that. When you have a state like Western Australia that you're taking out $20 billion a year, when you're going through the largest expansion and investment activity in the nation's history, and where you're dying for infrastructure. Without infrastructure, rents up in Karratha are going to $2,000 a week. They come down, but that's what they were. This is not going for growth, taking advantage of the nation's, not alone Western Australia's, opportunities. And we have to look, you're right, you have to look at what's driving this thing and what the opportunities those markets are driving and how you have to change your internal structures to this. And we were kind of stuck in a rut here. And I think the rut in the past has been this, first the Westminster system about prominence of government plus the states, but also there has been a strong case in many people's belief that the federal structures agreed to in 1901 were wrong. We should have a centralist British type government. Well, they have to realize that we have what we have to work from it and work. And we are really lucky in Western Australia, in fact, Australia. We're just sitting with resources, with population, rule of law, low sovereign risk, at the edge of China. What an opportunity. Every other nation would die for that. And we just have to be able to take opportunities. These only come around once in a few generations.
Okay, last question here.
Doug Hall, independent consultant. Thanks very much for your presentation, Minister. Just to probably take the strategic journey that Jim's just embarked on a little bit further, a more philosophical level, and noting your past involvement in the Institute of Public Affairs. It just seems to me that a lot of what you're talking about today is symptoms of probably a far deeper problem, which is a lack of dialogue or discourse in our society about what the fundamental role of government should be, the limits of that. And on the left side of politics, of course, a while back you had the advocates of third wave, people like Jeff Gallup, Mark Latham and Blair, who started to talk about roles and responsibilities, so responsibilities on the table. Unfortunately, the left side of politics seems to have walked completely away from that. Obviously, on the right side, there are still champions, and one could argue that Tony Abbott and the federal government is charging down this avenue. But I just wonder, how do we generate that greater discussion, more philosophical discussion about what the role of government is, what the limitations should be? After all, Hayek, in his dedication to Road to Serfdom, dedicated to socialists in all parties because he was concerned in the dark days of the Second World War, the right side of politics were just as bad as the left side of politics at growing government, increasing government intervention and so forth.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to go down that philosophical argument. When you mention Hayek, it's music to my ears. But what I wanted to talk about is an institutional structure within which all sides of governments, whether they're big government or otherwise, can operate effectively. There will be another Labor government sometime. I hope no time soon, but there will be. And we need, and there might be a government even of a left-leaning that has more redistribution even than most Labor governments. But we need a structure, a federal structure, that can accommodate that variation within the norm. We're a broad church, and we need a federal structure that accommodates it.